Well, howdy, and welcome to another edition of Rail Fan Robert's Reading Railroad.
Tonight, the Hardy Boys continue in part 7 of the Tower Treasure. Chapter 13, Teamwork. After Smuff left the house, Mr. Hardy sat back with a gesture of despair. That man, he said, handles an investigation so clumsily that Red Jackley will close up like a clam if Smuff manages to question him. At that moment, the telephone rang. The boys listened excitedly as Mr. Hardy answered. Hello? Oh, yes, Doctor. Is that so? Jackley will probably live only until morning. I could see him? Fine. Thank you. Goodbye. The detective put back the receiver and turned to the boys. I'll take that 6 o'clock plane to Albany, but if Smuff goes too, it may ruin everything. The Albany police and I must question Jackley first. When's the next commercial flight after 6? Joe asked. 7 o'clock. Like, then, said Frank, Smuff can take that one and question Jackley later. Come on, Joe, let's see what we can do to help Dad. Don't you boys do anything rash, their father warned. We won't. Frank led the way outdoors and started walking down the street. What's on your mind? And Joe asked as they reached the corner. We must figure out how to keep Detective Smuff in Bayport until 7 o'clock. But how? I don't know yet, but we'll find a way. We can't have him bursting into that hospital room and spoiling the chance of Dad getting a confession. Smuff might ruin things so the case will never be solved. You're right. The brothers walked down along the street in silence. They realized that the situation was urgent, but though they racked their brains trying to think of a way to prevent Detective Smuff from catching the 6 o'clock plane, it seemed hopeless. Let's round up our gang, Joe suggested finally. Perhaps I'll have some ideas. The Hardy boys found their friends on the tennis courts of Bayport High. Hi, fellows, said Chet Morton when he saw Frank and Joe approaching. You're too late for a game. Where have you been? We had something important to do, Frank replied. Say, we need your help. What's the matter? Asked Tony Preto. Oscar Smuff is trying to win that $1,000 reward and get himself on the Bayport police force by interfering in one of Dad's cases, Frank explained. We can't tell you much more than that, but the main thing is we want to keep him from catching the 6 o'clock plane. We don't want him to go until 7. What do you want us to do? Bill Hooper asked. Help us figure out how to keep Smuff in Bayport until 7 o'clock. Without having Chief Collig lock us up, Jerry Gilroy put in. Are you serious about this, Frank? Absolutely. If Smuff gets to a certain place before Dad can, the case will be ruined. And I don't mind telling you that it has something to do with Slim Robinson. Chet Morton whistled. Oh ho, I catch on, the tower business. If that's it, we'll make sure the 6 o'clock plane leaves here without that nutty detective. Chet had a special dislike for Smuff because the man had once reported him for swimming in the bay after hours. So our problem, said Phil solemnly, is to keep Smuff here and keep out of trouble ourselves. Right. Well, Jerry Gilroy said, let's put our heads together, fellows, and work out a plan. A dozen ideas were put forth, each wilder than the one before. Biff Hooper, with a wide grin, went so far as to propose kidnapping Smuff, binding him hand and foot, and setting him adrift in the bay in an open boat. We could rescue him later, he said. The proposal was so ridiculous that the others howled with laughter. Phil Cohen suggests setting the detective's watch back an hour. That plan, as Frank observed, was a good one, except for the minor difficulty of laying hands on the watch. We might send him a warning not to take a plane before 7 o'clock, Tony Prito said. Sign it with a skull and crossbones. That's a keen idea, Chet cried enthusiastically. Let's do it. Wait a minute, fellows, Frank spoke up. If Smuff ever found out who wrote it, we'd be up to our necks in trouble. We could all be arrested. I know, Joe cried suddenly, snapping his fingers. Why didn't I think of it before? And it's so simple, too. Well, tell us, Frank urged. Joe explained that every once in a while he and Frank went down to Rocco's fruit store to act as clerks while the owner went home to supper. He stayed open evenings until 9. Rocco's is only a block from Smuff's house. Smuff knows Frank and I go there, so he wouldn't be surprised to see us in the neighborhood. I suggest that a bunch of us meet casually down near the store, and one boy after another stops Smuff to talk. Maybe we can even get him into the shop. You know Smuff loves to eat. You can't hate him for that, Chet spoke up. I'll be glad to invite him in and buy an apple for his trip. A 15-minute delay for Smuff is all we need, Frank said. I think it's a swell idea, Biff spoke up, and I'm sure Mr. Rocco will cooperate. Who's going to persuade him? Phil asked. That's Frank and Joe's department, Jerry replied. Rocco was a hard-working man who had came from Italy only a few years ago. He was a simple, genial person and had great admiration for the Hardy Boys. The whole group made their way toward the fruit store, but only the Hardys went inside. The others spread out to watch for Smuff, who was expected to leave his house soon. Each boy went over his part in the plan. When Frank and Joe walked into the fruit store, they found the dark-eyed Rocco sorting oranges. Buono Sierra, he said. Good evening. How you like my fix the place? Looks well, Frank answered. New bins, better lights, then he added. How does your neighbor Smuff like it? Rocco threw up his hands in a gesture of disgust. Oh, that man. He make me mad. He say I charge too much. He tell me I ought to go back to old country. Don't pay any attention to him, Joe advised. Say, Mr. Rocco. Oh, he went on, you look tired. Why don't you go home for an hour or so and let Frank and me take over here? You think I look tired? That worried my wife. Then Rosa say I must close up early. Rocco sighed. You very kind boys. I do what you say. Come back 6:30. As Rocco removed his apron, he said, I fix trash in yard to burn. You do that? Glad to. Rocco then showed them a wire incinerator in the yard, then left the store. 5 minutes later, there was a whistle from the street, a signal from Jerry. Frank and Joe went to the front door to watch. Smuff was just backing out his car out of the driveway. As prearranged, Phil hurried over and stopped. The detective and the boy apparently got into an argument, but it didn't last long enough to satisfy Frank and Joe. The conversation took less than 2 minutes. Then Smuff backed out and into the street. Hey, Frank, said Joe, I have an idea. Go light that trash. Make it a roaring fire. Without further explanation, he dashed to the street, but Frank figured out what was in his brother's mind. Dashed through the store and into the yard. Quickly, he lighted the papers in the incinerator in several places. The rubbish blazed lustily. Joe was intently watching the scene down the street. Smuff was now being interviewed by Biff. Sheck came forward to urge Smuff to take some fruit with him on his trip. The detective hesitated, shook his head, and started off in his car. Only 5 of the necessary 15-minute delay had elapsed. Joe hesitated no longer. Running down the street, he held up one hand for the oncoming car to stop. "Come quick, Smuff," he called out. "There's a fire back of Rocco's." "Well, you put it out. I'm in a hurry," the detective told the boy tardily. "You mean you let all the Bayport burn down just 'cause you're in a hurry?" Joe pretended to scoff. Smuff winced, but still did not move. Joe said, "Hurried back to the store. Well, Frank and I will have to take care of it alone." This brought the detective to action. He realized he might be missing a chance to become a hero. In a flash, he drove his car down the street. He parked in front of the fruit store. "Where's the fire?" Smuff cried out, nearly bumping into Frank, who was dashing from the front door of Rocco's. "The fire is back there in the yard," Frank pretended to pant. "You go look, see if we need to turn in an alarm." Smuff dashed inside the store and hurried to the yard. By this time, the Hardy friends had gathered in Rocco's fruit store. They asked excitedly what was going on. "Frank, Joe," yelled Smuff from the rear of the store. "Where's Rocco? Where's a pail? Where's some water?" Chapter 14. The Confession. "Rocco's not around," Joe replied to Smuff. "There's water in the sink in the back. Shall I call the fire department?" "No, I can manage this," Smuff declared. "But where's a pail?" Frank dashed into the back room and found a pail under the sink, filled it with water, and handed the pail to Smuff, who hurried to the yard. He doused the incinerator flames, which hissed and crackled, then died. "Some people have no sense," Smuff commented. "The idea of anyone starting a fire and going off and leaving it. I'll bet that was Rocco's work. As for you boys, you had to call me. Didn't have the savvy to put out a simple fire." "Well, good thing you were around," Frank observed, suppressing a smile. "I'll say it was," Smuff agreed. "Chief Collig is sure going to hear about this." "Oh, please don't tell him about us," Joe spoke up, half closing his eyes so Smuff could not see the twinkle in them. "I didn't mean that. Oscar Smuff is no squealer. I mean, Collig's going to hear what I did." The detective chuckled. "One more notch in my gun, as the cowboys say." Suddenly, Smuff sobered and looked at his wristwatch. "Oh, no," he cried out. 10 minutes to 6. I can't make my plane." "That's a shame," Frank said consolingly. "But cheer up, Smuff. There's a 7 o'clock plane for Albany. I wish you luck in your interview." Smuff stormed out of the fruit store and disappeared with his car. The Hardys and their friends burst into roars of laughter, which did not stop until a woman customer came into the shop. All the boys but Frank and Joe left. Rocco returned at 6:30, pleased that so much fruit had been sold during his absence. "You been a salesman than Rocco," he grinned widely. The Hardys went home, well satisfied with their day's work. The 6 o'clock plane had left without Smuff. Their father could make his trip to the hospital without the annoying detective's interference. Fenton Hardy did not return home until the next afternoon. When the boys came from school, they found him in high spirits. "Solve the mystery?" Joe asked eagerly. "Practically. First of all, Jack Lee is dead." "Did he confess?" "You're not very sympathetic toward the poor fellow, Joe." "Yes, he confessed. Fortunately, Oscar Smuff didn't show up while Jack Lee was talking." Frank and Joe glanced at each other, and their father smiled quietly. "I have an idea," he said, "that you two sleuths know more about this Smuff business than you would care to tell. Well, anyhow, the Albany police and I had a clear field. I saw Jack Lee before he died and questioned him about the tower robbery." "Did he admit everything?" "Jack Lee said he came to Bayport with the intention of robbery. He stole a car, smashed it up, took checks. Then he went to rob the ticket office. When he failed in that, he decided to hang around town for a few days. He hit upon Tower Mansion as his next effort. Jack Lee entered the library with gloves on, opened the safe, and took out the jewelry and securities. What did he do with the loot? Well, that's what I'm coming to. It was not until Jack Lee knew he was at the point of death that he did confess to the Tower affair. Then he said, "Yes, I took the stuff, but I didn't dare try selling anything of it right away, so I hid it. You can get the stuff back easily. It's in the old tower." And that was all he said. Jack Lee lost consciousness and never regained it. When did Smuff get there? Joe asked eagerly. Not until after Jack Lee had gone into a coma, Mr. Hardy replied. We both sat by his bed hoping the man would awaken, but he died within an hour. Just where Jack Lee hid the loot in the old tower, he was never able to say. Does Smuff know what Jack Lee said? No. Well, if the loot's hidden in the old Applegate Tower, we'll find it in no time, Frank exclaimed. Well, Tower Mansion has two towers, the old and the new, Joe reminded him. We'll search the old tower first. The story seems likely enough, Mr. Hardy remarked. Jack Lee would gain nothing by lying about it on his deathbed. He probably became panicky after he committed the robbery and hid in the old tower until he was able to get away safely. No doubt he decided to hide the stuff there and take a chance on coming back for it sometime after the affair had blown over. Joe nodded. That is why Jack Lee couldn't be traced through the jewels and the bonds. They were never disposed of. They were lying in the old tower all this time. I tried to get him to tell me just what part of the tower the loot was hidden, Mr. Hardy continued, but he died before he could say any more. Too bad, said Frank, but it shouldn't be hard to find the loot, and now we have a general idea of where it is. Probably Jack Lee didn't hide it very carefully. Since the old tower has been unoccupied for a long time, the stuff would be safe there from snoopers. Joe jumped up from his chair. I think we ought to get busy and go search the old tower right away. Oh boy, maybe we can hand old Mr. Applegate his jewels and bonds this afternoon and clear Mr. Robinson. Let's go. I'll leave it to you boys to make the search, said Mr. Hardy with a smile. Then you can have the satisfaction of turning over the stolen property to Mr. Applegate. I guess you can get along without me on this case from now on. Well, we wouldn't have gotten very far if it hadn't been for you, Frank declared. And I wouldn't have gotten very far if it hadn't been for you, so we're even. Even, Mr. Hardy's smile broadened. Good luck to you. As the boys started from the study, Frank said, Thanks, Dad. I only hope the Applegates don't throw us out when we ask to be allowed to look around inside the old tower. Just tell them, his father advised, that you have a pretty good clue as to where the bonds and jewels are hidden, and they'll let you search. Joe grinned. Frank, we'll have that $1,000 reward before the day is over. The brothers raced from the house, confident that they were about to solve the tower treasure mystery.
No part of this episode may be reproduced without my personal permission. Railfan Roberts Reading Railroad is a production of Raccoon Gaming Rails Railroad Productions. And all podcast episodes are owned by Raccoon Gaming Rails Railroad Productions.